So on the top now of Chaf Amid Beis, Amalei Ima Kayemetz, with a question mark. You're asking me about my father. Why don't you ask me about my mother? Amalei Ima Kayemetz. Is your mother alive? Which is Rafia's sister. Amalei Abakaim. Why didn't you ask me if my father's alive? Back and forth. Obviously, he didn't want to answer the question, namely that both his father and his mother had passed on. Amalei L'Shmaya, L'Shameh. So now Rabchia, realizing that his brother and his sister had passed away, he instructs his second in command, Halotzli min olah, take off my shoes. But v'holech acharad, Kelai, lebeis hamerchos. And then after you take off my shoes, I'm on the way to the bathhouse, which means two things. Number one, that in a shmur rechoka, all you need is 1 day of Avelos. And not only that, you don't even need 1 day of Avelos because Bixas Hayom Kikulo. All this is based on the Ilas Hasandal. The Gemara says, Shmamino Tla Shmamino Ovel Osa B'Nilas Hasandal. He's not allowed to wear shoes. Shmamino Shmur Rechokeno Egles Al Yom Echad. Ushmamino Miksa Yom Kikulo. This is so fascinating. You have 1 day of Avelos, and you're going to say Miksa Yom Kikulo. Ella. There's no Melos over here, so it's Yom Echad. I wonder what happens in Shomer Yom Keged Yom and Katan. Maybe they're also replying. In any event, we see clearly that we're going to accept the halacha like Rabbi Akiva, that in a Shmur Rechoka, it's 1 day of Avelos, which is against Rabbi Chia, who was possibly like the Chachamim, that even in the case of a Shmur Rechoka, you need a full Shiva. So when it says Rabbi Chia L'chud, Rabbi Achia L'chud. So there's Chia and Achia. So what we've been dealing with before is Rabbi Achia, and he's of the opinion that we pass like Chacham that even in Shmur Rechoka you need Shiva and Shloshim. However, Rabbi Chia, who's a different person, and that's Rab's uncle, he's of the opinion that we pass like Rabbi Akiva, and Shmur Rechoka requires just 1 day of Avelos. Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Ovid, Shama Shmua Krova Berege. So on Yontif, he found out that he lost one of his relatives. But by the time he would begin his Avelos, which would be after Regel, it was already a Shmur Rechoka, because 30 days had passed since the death of his relative. What's the suffix of Rabbi Yossi? Olalo v'yenu noig el yom echad. Should we say that since the regel itself is Ola l'shloshin, that was our maskana, so it means that Einu Noeg El Yom Echad. Well, what do you mean he only observes 1 day of Avelus? In other words, he's not being Noeg Nihudi Avelus during the Yontif, because in the mitzvah of Samachta B'Chagecha. So since he has no Nihudi Avelus, it's as if he heard about the death after the regular. And by that time, it was already 30 days. So it's not a question when he actually heard the Shmua, but rather when he would have a Kiyum Avelus. And in this case, there was no kiyum aveilus whatsoever. And therefore, says Rabbi Yossi, becomes a shmur rechoka. Funny Rabbi Ada, Devin Kisri, Kami Rabbi Yochanan, Shama Shmur Krova, B'Shabbos, Ulemotzoi Shabbos Nasis Rechoka. So I guess we're talking about a case where Shabbos was day 30 since the Kfura, right? So in that case, since it was day 30, but it was Shabbos, so he couldn't have a kiyum avelus, even though it was within 30 days. Technically it was a shvua krova, and he would be required a full shiva. But the reason why it's a shvua rechoka is because on Shabbos he cannot be noeg avelus. So there's no kiyum avelus on Shabbos. And by the time you get to Motzi Shabbos, you're already up to 31 days since the mess died, and therefore ain't no egel yomech. And that's a big chiddush because there is avelus on Shabbos, but just not b'far hesya. Korea o eno korea. In the case of a shmur rechoka, is there kriya? In other words, what's machayev kriya? Is it the shmua, or is the kriya part of avelus? Rabbi Mani Omar eno korea. Rabbi Chanina Omar korea. Amalei Rabbi Mani le Rabbi Chanina. Bishlem l'didi damina eno korea. There's no kriya in the case which moruchoka hainu delo. I can tell you why. There's no kriya. Hainu delo ika avelut shiva. Kriya has to be attached to avelus of shiva. And here we're talking about a shmur rechoka, and there's no avelus of shiva. So the chiyuv kriya, according to Rabbi Mani, has to be connected with shiva. So it's not the shmiyah and the shmua that generates kriya. It's the mitzvah of shiva, of avelus. Kriya is part and parcel of avelus. But you're saying that this kriya below shiva mi'ika, is there really kriya without shiva, without avelus? So now it comes out that the machlok between Rav Mani and Rav Chanina is that Rav Mani says that kriya is part of shiva, and Rav Chanina never accepted that position. The Gemara is going to ask a kasha on Rav Mani. You're telling me that there's no such thing as kriya without shiva below. Vatani isi avua de Rabbi Zera. The Amalei, according to another tradition, it was avua de Rabbi Zera. So it's either the father of Rabbi Zera or the brother of Rabbi Zera, coming to Rabbi Zera, and they taught the following halacha: Misha ein lo choluk likroa. He has no garment to rip. For example, he borrowed someone's clothing, so he's not allowed to tear their clothing. That's what some people do when they go to the kotel and they borrow. So Misha ein lo choluk likroa. But v'nizdami lo b'toch Shiva, in the middle of the 7 days of Shiva, he comes across a chaluk, his own chaluk. Korea. He's chayiv in kriya. Right? So, li'achar Shiva eno Korea. So if he finally gets hold of a garment that's his, and Shiva's passed, he doesn't do kriya. So this L'chora proves Rav Mani. I don't know why it's the Kasha on Rav Mani. 1 second. Rav Mani was the one who said that what? That you have to connect Kriya to Shiva. Here's a case of Nizdamilo b'toch Shiva, Korea, Lachar Shiva, ain't a Korea. 1 second. The Achar Shiva ain't a Korea. What did a kasha on? I missed something here. I think, let me try to suggest something. Rav Mani holds you need the full 7 days of a Kiyum Avelus of Shiva in order to be Machayev you in Kriya. So, for example, in a Shmua Krov, he only has 1 day of Shiva, of Avelus, and therefore there's no Kriya. That's the Shmua Rechoka. Now, what about a case in which he couldn't do Kriya at the beginning of Shiva? He didn't have ownership over his own garment. Now he gets a garment. And he's Chayiv in Kriya. Why is he Chayiv in Kriya? You don't have the full 7 days. Only Rabbi Zera Basrei. Moed v'amurim b'chamisha meisei mitzvah aval imo korea v'holech. So if he loses one of his 5 relatives, other than father and mother, he lost a brother, he lost a sister, he lost a child, he lost a daughter, or a son, or a wife. In all those cases, there's no Kriya without Shiva. But in the case of V'imo, there is Kriya, even though there's no Shiva. So therefore, you could have Kriya in the cases of V'imo, even after Shiva. So this is now we get to the Kasha on Rav Mani. I jumped the gun a little bit. The Kasha on Rav Mani is based on the fact that we're establishing now that for V'imo, you could have a Kriya even without Shiva. So you see that fundamentally, Kriya is independent of Shiva. And the Gemara answers, according to Rav Mani, Kitanya hi l'chod V'imo. This is not Kriya. When it says al aviv al imo korea, the word korea should be understood as korea l'shem kavod. It's an act of kibbutz. But as far as real kriya in and of itself, that's part of Shiva. And if you have to be korea for a parent even after Shiva, that's only midin kavod, but not midin kriya per se. Tan Rabbanan, we learned in the Brisa, kol ha'omur beparshas kohanim shekoim metami lahen is oval misabel aleihem. So which relatives generate a chiv, with their death generate a chiv? Let's take a look in the parsha in the Emor, where the Torah tells you which relatives the Kohen is allowed to be metami. It's even obligated to be metami in order to bury the dead. Eluhem, Ishto, Aviv, Imo, Achiv, Achoso, Beno, Ubito. Osifu Aleim, Achiv, Ve'achosa, Besula, Me'imo. So I'm not sure exactly what Osifu Aleim means. I mean, I know how to translate the words Osifu Aleim, but it means that even though these are not mentioned in the Parsha Emor as far as Tumas Kohanim is concerned, nevertheless, the Rabbanan hold that here too, you have an Avelus of Shiva Yom. But that's only achosa psula me'imo. V'achosa nesua bein me'ov bein me'imo. Again, if his sister was married, then there's going to be avelus of shiva. But if his sister was not married, then there's only going to be shiva if it's achoso me'imo. Ukshem shemisabel aleim, kach misabel al shniyim shalahem. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. So what's the case of shniyim? Shniyim always means the same relative, but one generation either earlier or later. So if you have to be misabel on your father, you have to be misabel on your father's father. If you have to be misabel on your son, then you'll be misabel on your son's son. That's called shniyim. And that's Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer, Eino misabel el al ben beno, ve'al avi of. The only time that we apply the chiv avelis to shniyim is only with regard to aviv or beno. The Chacham Omrim kol misabel ol misabel imo. Halachi of misabel imo. It's like you commensurate. You prava avelus as if you were an oven. And I think the Chacham are referring even to his father's father or his son's son. That it's not real avelus, but rather it's sort of like commensurating or identifying with a close relative who is now in mourning. So now what's the difference exactly between real avelus and misabel imo? Chacham hainu tanakama, ikebeinayu imo bebayis. In other words, if the word imo and you commensurate with the avel, like let's say your father is sitting shiva for his father, which is your grandfather, then your avelus, according to the Chachamim, is not real avelus. It only applies in the same bias, in the base of it, where your father is sitting shiva for his father. Ki hadi amarle Rav Lechia Brei, v'chein amar Rav, amarle Rav Huna l'Rav Brei, the apa nahog avelus. The lo apa lo tinog avelus. So let's say, for example, Chashom, your father-in-law passed away, your mother-in-law passed away. So in the presence of your wife, you observe mourning as if you were an oven. And that's beso. Beso means in close proximity, in the presence of. Mar ukva shachiv le bar chamua. So Mar Ukva had a son, and he lost his brother-in-law. Savar lemesiv alei shiva ushloshim. Mar Ukva was going to observe Shiva Shloshim on behalf of the loss of his brother. So Rav Huna goes to visit him. He finds him in a state of Avelus. Amalei Sud Naisa Bois Lemecha. He asks him, are you interested in eating what's called the Sudas Havra, the first meal after you come back from the cemetery, after the burial of your dead? So he was making fun of him as if to say, oh, you enjoy that Su'ud. That's why you want to Prava Avelus. There's an identification with Avelus in the case of your wife who's in Avelus because she lost one of her parents. But for your brother-in-law, that's already a different story. So it's only a father-in-law and a mother. The Sanya Misha Meis Chamiv or Chamoso. In the case of Chamiv and Chamoso, then it's Misabel Ima. Ima meaning with your wife. And therefore, any Red Shai Lochem is each Lios Kocheles, Lios Pokeses. Right? No use of rouge or eyeshadow. Elakofa Mitaso, Benoig Ima Avelus. He also should sit on an overturned bed and Prava Avelus. So can he, Shemeis Chameya, Chamos, if she lost her father-in-law or mother-in-law, she shouldn't use cosmetics and puts herself up. Ella kofe mitasav and ohegis imo avelus. She should be misabel together with her husband. The Tanya Idach and another brayso we learned. Afal pishamu ena rashay lochem es ishta lios kocheles lios pokeses. When she lost one of her parents, his in-laws, the MS Amru Mozeges Loas Hakos, Matzas Lo Mitum Archetzes Lo Panov Yadav Rad. And that means that she doesn't have to be Noeg Avelus. Kashana Dodi. The first brisa states that a husband must also observe Shiva for his wife's parents, his in-laws. The second brisa speaks of a wife who's observing Shiva, and she's making her husband's bed, washing his face, his hands, and his feet. And that implies that her husband himself is not observing Shiva. And he's allowed to bathe. So she is observing Shiva for her parents, and he's not observing Shiva. Elav Shmamina, Kan B'cham V'chamoso, Kan B'shar Krovin. In the first brisa, we're talking about a case of losing one of your in-laws, one of your wife's parents. But here, in the second brisa, we're talking about a case where the wife is mourning for some of her other relatives other than her parents, and therefore her husband does not have to observe a village. Ma'amino. Kanyanami hachilo amru lefodi isha lechamiv vechamoso bilvad. Not if she's sitting shiva for any of the other relatives. Okay, this is where we're going to stop for today.